Welcome back to the Mythic Dungeon International. If you'd like to support the prize pools for the MDI or the AWC, you can always check out some of the in-game toys, the Transmorph Beacon or the fireworks, to be able to support those prize pools at the end of the year for BlizzCon. I'm Jack, and joining me on the desk here is Sloot, Zyronic here, and Sours, guys. And moving on to Game 2, we saw a dominant performance out of Battle for Champion here. Now we're going to be going to the 4th and 5th seeds here with Buff Warrior, Nerf Rogue versus Accompany here. And Sours, we see a dominant Taiwanese team coming out of here in Buff War.
That's right. Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue is the only Taiwanese team that made top 8, and they're also the #1 rated Raider.io Taiwanese team. But you know, we've talked about this before. Raider.io isn't really that important for the MDI. It shows one thing. It shows you have knowledge of the dungeons. But if you come to these dungeons and you try to do what you're doing to push Raider.io to go fast, you're not going to go fast. You're going to lose.
Yeah, and we've seen previously, as we mentioned in last week with the Western region, where you could have teams that are pushing fast and pushing quickly and everything like that. But it's ironic. I'd even say, you know, looking at Method EU from this year versus last year, it was so much of a difference between a team that was pushing last year versus this team, which is just focused on the MDI itself.
Yeah, there was a huge difference from Method EU this year versus last year. Method EU last year, they tended to more focus on doing the live strategies just a little bit faster, whereas this year they had a lot more tailored strategies to the dungeons.
Yep, and going into Game 1, we're going to be having the Motherload with Tyrannical Explosive, Skittish Sloot. This is going to be, you know, a trash-packed dungeon here and a lot of explosive orbs that they're going to have to deal with.
Yeah, you know, we talked about the explosive orbs just before this. An affix, especially in the world of prot warriors and the meta that we live in right now, Skittish, not something we're usually concerned with. However, especially pre-first boss here, there's a lot of mobs that kind of charge randomly. The tank will need to kite a bit depending on too much damage. Orbs are going to be going all over the place. It is possible that some mobs kind of slip up and maybe charge in a direction away from the prot warrior, leading to that 30% threshold of being ranged from a melee and turn around and smack one of the DPS. It's possible, unlikely in the prot warrior world, but it's something that you have to watch out for. But explosive combo with needing to kite this trash and mobs charging all over the place, grease guns going off on melee. Oof, this one's going to be rough.
And we've seen previously how, you know, the triple melee builds have just been dominating so far. So going heavy here on kicks, as we've seen previously, Sours, you know, what are the big things they need to be watching out for in this dungeon between each wing? We've seen, you know, there's each wing's just a little bit different in how you have to worry about the mob density.
Well, you say each wing, but if we're being honest here, Jack, there's only one wing in this dungeon, and it's all the trash up to the first boss. Everything after the first boss, we don't really ever see it that much. You know, there's a lot of these casters in the first one. They're going to be casting heals on each other. They're going to be freezing people. And once you kill all of those, you're home sailing.
That's right, and as we're looking at the poll results here, Buff Warrior and Nerf Rogue with a significant lead here over Team Accompany here. So we're going to dive right into Game 1, Buff Warrior versus Nerf Rogue, Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue versus Accompany here on the Motherload.
My God, you're tall, good sir.
Thank you.
Zyro, welcome to the desk with us here. So, Motherload, Zyro, we talked about this earlier. Explosive with Motherload. Now, we do have kind of the relief of Tyrannical, where the bosses do more damage and, of course, have a higher health versus the Trash. But Trash is going to be really scary here, as we see a fair bit of it skipped at the start with Shadow Meld coming out. Shadow Meld, a Mass Stealth coming out of Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue.
Yeah, and instantly already huge pull right away from Buff Warrior and Nerf Rogue. They're just trying to get as much Trash as possible, and with their Bloodlust off this first pull right away.
Yeah, I'm liking what I'm seeing too. They kind of just said, you know, I don't care about explosive for the mobs that come in. We're going to line of sight around this central wall here in this hut, and we're just going to get as much damage as we can from these mobs. Kill most of them before it gets too out of hand with explosive, and now they just have to clean up any small explosives. So really big, impressive pull coming out of here by them, but Accompany, not to be forgotten as well, with their own large pull and Bloodlust popped.
Yeah, it's important to look at the differences between the affixes from last week and this week. You guys talked about it before the break briefly, but the biggest difference between bolstering and explosive is kind of like a fixed thing. You know, all you have to do, especially with the double Outlaw Rogue comp, is all you have to do is swap to the explosive and use one GCD on it. As an Outlaw Rogue, you don't really lose too much AoE damage because your Blade Flurry is still doing damage to everything outside of it. So, if done correctly, explosive should be a little faster than bolstering, with, you know, a lot more of a consequence if you mess it up.
Yeah, the only worry I have is we actually have a death go out for the Windwalker Monk on Accompany right now. We have a cheat death proc, of course, on Aches as well, one of the two rogues, so a bit of danger coming in from them. Finally, they get the battle res off as they manage to stabilize with their explosives going up, but another one's about to go off. Managed to cleave it down last second. Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue, another big pull here, making sure that they cleave all of this first reaping down before they get too much trash getting out of this. But you're not the only person new here, Zara. We also also have the Unholy DK joining us here on Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue.
Yeah, which is definitely an interesting choice, especially in a tyrannical setting, because what a lot of these teams like to do is they like to pull all of the trash before the first boss, which means they can't really pull any reaping packs into bosses outside of maybe the first boss. So a lot of the Unholy DK is going to be useful for a lot of AoE damage early in the dungeon, but once we get to the bosses, the boss to boss to boss later in the dungeon, you're going to really see that DK fall off.
So a bit of sloppiness here for Team Accompany. They do manage to kind of get themselves back on their feet, use their battle res early. That won't be available for about 7.5 minutes now. Buff Warrior, Nerf Rogue, still chewing through the trash. A bit of a hit there on Loda. I suspect one of the grease guns from one of the mech jockeys in there, which we know is an ability that actually targets random members regardless of the tank's proximity to the mobs themselves. So this is kind of what we were talking about earlier. A lot of danger that comes in from these packs. Fortunately for them, not fortified, as the rogues dip quite low though.
Yeah, definitely. And the thing about those mech jockeys is the preferred route, the preferred way of getting most of your percentage in this dungeon is to actually let the mech jockeys transform into the peacekeepers by jumping into the robot. So you don't really see too much of the grease guns coming out here. It was pretty unfortunate if he would have gone down there to that grease gun.
There are 3 mech jockeys there actually right now, because unfortunately you can't have 2 mech jockeys jump into 1 peacekeeper. So they kind of pulled a pretty fruitful pull full of mech jockeys. Only one of them managed to get in the peacekeeper. And as you mentioned, Zara, one of the big benefits to allowing you to jump in the peacekeeper is you get the double percentage whammy. So you get the kill for the peacekeeper robot themselves and also for the mech jockey, which dies as soon as the peacekeeper dies too. So pretty dangerous mob, but big risk, big reward there for them. Accompany chewing through still their first round of reaping. It's taken a while because those peacekeeper mobs from reaping we know spawn with baseline 50% health of the original, and the peacekeepers, which we've mentioned a million times now, have quite a bit of HP.
Yeah, it's just one of those trade-offs, right, where if you're dealing with one mob that doesn't really do too much other than just massive tank damage, especially in this trash-rich portion of the dungeon where there's so many mobs that you need to interrupt or CC or stun or just deal with as a group, the Peacekeeper's giving double mob count. You want to get as many of them as possible so that you can just kind of cleave them down while you deal with everything else.
It really is, a lot of the bottlenecking for the trash efficiency that you do at the beginning of the dungeon here is tank survivability. Of course, there is some splash damage, as we mentioned, onto the group as well in the form of either mech jockeys. We see the second round of reaping come out here from Buff Warrior, Nerf Rogue. Tree of Life immediately gets popped by Loda here as they kind of filter everything in together and look to do as much damage as possible to the reaping before spawning those peacekeepers on the side. But this is a pretty substantial bowl here. They have a couple of peacekeepers for the real ones and on top of it the reaping mobs.
Yeah, but once again, they're just super safe. Like you said, the popping the Tree of Life here means nobody's really going to go down. Both of the rogues still have their cheat deaths available, and the DK is just pumping out massive AoE damage right now on top of the warrior tank doing massive AoE damage. While this looks like a really large pull, it's actually very, very well contained.
Grave Bolts, of course, going off just a bit there, one on Loda. Now, there are 3 types of souls that spawn from reaping. There's a caster one, the Tormented. We do have, of course, the melee kind of version that attack the tank that add a dot to you, and then the tank versions as well that do a large AoE in front. Important to note about the Grave Bolts specifically, though, is that they do actually hit random members of the party. So if you get too many of them splashing on random members with whatever else may be going on, like a grease gun, you could actually have a pretty easy death.
Yeah, also to mention, that does do 25% of your max HP. So if you get hit by 4 of them at the same time, if you're unlucky to have that happen to you, it's just an insta-kill if you don't have an extra shield on top of you.
So we've given a lot of attention and love to explosive Zyra, but skittish in here as well, just to let those at home know, the tank produces less threat in the dungeon. We do know that threat is a direct multiplier of damage done, which is why it's not something we focus too much on, because as you can see on the damage meters here, especially on the side of Buff Warrior, Nerf Rogue, the Warrior does a substantial amount of damage, especially in this AoE scenario. So not anything they have to worry too much about, but it could be a bit dangerous if they need to kite out, surpassing that from melee to range 10 to 30% threshold of threat needed to surpass whatever the primary target is. That's getting a bit mechanical for the time being, but Accompany now is just dealing with their second reaping wave, and looking for the third reaping wave here is Buff Warrior, Nerf Rogue.
Yeah, I'm not sure why their team name is Buff Warrior. They seem totally fine to me. We see them moving on to the back end of this sort of circle area of the dungeon where they have to start dealing with refreshment vendors as well as a lot of these addled thugs and hired assassins. All of these have their own separate mechanics that need to be interrupted or baited. So the refreshment vendor is probably the most dangerous of them, I have to imagine. They do a channel on a random member in the group, and if that channel does finish, that member gets frozen for 6 seconds.
Yeah, a lot of damage coming in, not to mention the casual refreshment as well, that once it goes off, it is not dispellable, and it will heal with a healing over time effect on whoever it casts on. So definitely want to make sure you interrupt that. A lot of interrupts needed in general. Fortunately for them, they do have grips, displaces, stuns, weapons and 4 melee, essentially, that can help interrupt on that 15-second cooldown timer. Accompany is still chewing through their trash at half percentage done, 50%. We've seen the third Reaping Wave here, procced 4 buff warrior Nerf rogue, and pulled over into the final trash pack before that first boss.
Yeah, and once again, this is just a big Reaping Wave of a bunch of mobs that don't really do too much other than apply a tank debuff, pulled into about 3 or 4 mobs that need to be CC'd down. So once again, while it looks pretty dangerous, it's really just only tank damage that they have to deal with, and that warrior, their health bar doesn't seem to be moving much at all.
Jing BB doing a lot of damage. Morito, unfortunately, eating one of the Lost Soul, which is one of the Reaping mobs, the tank version, one of their AoE shadow crashes on the ground. Now, that does a tremendous amount of shadow damage, but also for 1 minute decreases your maximum health by 20%. And we can see the danger that output as Cheat Death has procced for Morito. Won't have that available for, if I'm not mistaken, 6 minutes, Zyro. So a pretty substantial timer, but a nice safety net for them to have nonetheless. Accompany now at 58%, getting ready for that third Reaping Wave.
Yeah, and it was pretty typical here. We usually see these teams at least proc their 4th Reaping Wave before they plan on moving on further into the dungeon. We've even seen some teams go up to as high as 95, 96% before they even attempt to pull the first boss, because all of the mob count here is just so efficient to deal with.
Yeah, it is very kind of a coin flippy dungeon, or the two-phase dungeon, if you will. You deal with all the trash, and then you just kind of deal with 4 bosses in a row. And those bosses are really what's going to be tough. I'm particularly worried about the third boss in a tyrannical setting right now. Pure fire damage onto the tank, not blockable if I'm not mistaken. So you're kind of spamming Ignore Pain on the prot where you do have the luxury of a Spell Reflect once in a while, but you know that's a far ways away at the moment. We're about to have 80% for buff warrior Nerf rogue here on the left, getting ready for, as you mentioned, Zara, their 4th Reaping Wave pre-first boss.
Yeah, and this is probably going to be the most dangerous Reaping Wave. They've pulled a lot of caster mobs in this section of the dungeon, and as far as DPS or group danger goes, the caster mobs tend to be the most dangerous, with each cast, like we mentioned earlier, doing 25% of a player's max health. So lots of intermittent group damage, but it looks like they're just shadow melting that wave off.
Yeah, who cares? Right onto the coin-operated Crowd Pummeler. The first boss here, as we see immediately, well, actually some of the Reaping did manage to pour in, not sure if on purpose or not, but we did see the Shroud come in as well in here, so lots to deal with here as the tank is struggling to pick everything up. Jim getting down to 1%, and we do have a death over on the tank. Battle Res comes up immediately. Unfortunately, Morito, the rogue who did not have that Cheat Death access prior because of that slip-up, goes down. Kazaros goes down too. This is an absolute disaster for buff warrior Nerf rogue. It looks like it's going to be a full team wipe here. Explosives are going off left and right. Full team wipe here for buff warrior Nerf rogue. They're going to have to recollect themselves as Accompany looks to capitalize on the scenario.
Yeah, it's just one of those things you hate to see. The tank instantly going down right with all that Reaping alive. It means your highest damage dealer is just going to instantly get cleaved down, targeted by all the mobs. I don't think there's any way that you can res a tank fast enough there to save that pull. It's just, I mean, once the tank's dead, you kind of just have to keep.
You know, ironically, the thing that could have saved them is the first person that got aggro was Morito. Morito did not have the Cheat Death, which we mentioned earlier in the chat. He would have had just enough time to kind of get that Cheat Death, maybe vanish once the tank came back up and snap some threat. But unfortunate for them, so they're going to struggle to come back. Fortunately, they did not use their Bloodlust. We still have 30 seconds on the clock for that on both teams, actually. Accompany just now kind of slow and steady wins the race for them here. They're looking to proc their 4th Reaping Wave. We'll see what they do with it, if they're played aggressively or not on top of the boss. Now, Zyra, let's talk about, I'm not sure if they intended to actually bring the Reaping to the boss there. That was a bit odd.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me either way, honestly. It's kind of one of the safer things to do to not pull Reaping with the boss, especially in this. I mean, you know, these teams can look at the other team. They probably knew they were slightly ahead, but they probably wanted to increase that lead. So it wouldn't surprise me if they meant to pull it into the boss for the Unholy DK to just funnel a single target damage into the boss during this damage amp phase.
Yeah, so we see the Unholy DK using that anti-magic gel there for that first round of AoE shock damage on the group, the static shock. That adds a fair bit of damage. Doing well as well to move out of the way. Now, the name of the game on this boss is he will spawn 3-foot bombs randomly in the room that you will need to redirect before they explode back into the boss. If one explodes on the group, it will actually increase your damage taken by 50% for substantial time with a fire dot. If you redirect all 3 into the boss, it's 50% damage taken per stack. So the absolute key here in terms of min-maxing is to get 2 in right away and then kick the 3rd one right before the 2-stack expire / 3rd one explodes to maximize your uptime of damage taken on the boss.
Right. Also, in addition to that, he will occasionally do a large frontal slam, which we see go out right there, the lightning bolt on the ground. and you will also do a big static pulse, which hits the entire group for massive AoE damage and knocks them back if they don't have a magic immunity.
Yeah, so a lot of damage coming in, so you can imagine if they were taking 50% increased damage in this tyrannical setting. Now, you are seeing piles of money kind of go around the sides of the room, and nobody is very greedily running over to them to collect them. That's because the boss will collect them periodically if he is within proximity of them. Per pile collected, he will do 10% increased damage for the remainder of the fight. So you want to kind of kite around the room. You do have a finite amount of space before you start to run out, and the boss will start absorbing some of these coins. But honestly, at this gear level in an 18, I don't expect that'll be the case.
Now, we do see that Buff War Nerf Rogue has opted to completely save their Bloodlust. It looks like they're planning on probably using that for a big pull right after the boss. Usually you will see teams use that Bloodlust on one of the damage amp phases like we've seen Accompany do, which is why they're actually further ahead on the boss than Buff War Nerf Rogue is.
Yeah, and you know, Accompany here is, I was actually just about to mention that. They're 5% ahead now. That wipe did wonders for them. But we have seen Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue move substantially faster than Accompany, so they certainly have their hill to climb right now. But if they can pull it off, it would be pretty impressive by the end of the dungeon. Big static shot coming on here for Accompany. Accompany also hasn't proc their 4th Reaping Wave. They're at 79%, so they're looking to do that after the boss. A lot of unhealthy team members here on a Buff War Nerf Rogue, just sub 20%, but they do manage to stabilize as Accompany looking to finish the boss off at 8% right now.
Yeah, and we did just see the 3rd bomb go into the boss for Buff War Nerf Rogue, so they do have that 2.5 times increased damage buff here. Bomb also going into the boss on the side of Accompany, so both teams dealing with the mechanics.
Goal! As Accompany downs their boss and they get ready to move on to the trash towards the second boss, looking to likely get somewhere upwards of mid-90s to high 90s worth of trash percent, proccing their last percent, as most Western teams have done at least, after the second boss dies so that they can kind of take their little minecart trip down. But this trash, I would say, not as dangerous for the rest of the party, but very dangerous for the tank in the form of the Earth Shapers. If a lot of those bolts get off, which do a ton of nature damage on the tank, it could be pretty devastating. So they're going to have a really good CC, crowd control, and interrupts.
Yeah, but it's not quite as dangerous as last week. We had the opportunity for a lot of bolstering stacks on the Earth Shapers because they do have more HP than the other mobs in the group. So there was a chance, there was that off chance that one Earth Shaper rock bolt could get off that was 6 times bolstering and would just one-shot somebody in your group. It'd be pretty unfortunate, but no chance of that this week.
Zara, I've never seen you so happy as imagining that, but we do unfortunately have one of the bombs go off, and Tomboy does go down as he gets clipped by one of the explosives on the side. Fortunately, they have snapshotted or checkpointed their location by killing the first boss, able to just release, not use their battle res, and get right back into action. We see some of those rock lances come out as Ching does well to spell reflect that one right back into the Earth Shaper. You can do that. Spell reflect, of course, only available every 25 seconds, and will get consumed on the first spell that hits it. So it's not something you can always rely on entirely. Accompany now has killed a bit of trash, dealing with their 4th wave, and has opted to mass stealth right up to the second boss room at 90%.
Yeah, we've seen a few different strategies come out of the teams here. I think the most interesting strategy we saw was from Team Abracadabra, where they hit their 100% mark and then instantly mounted up, went to the 3rd boss, and shadow molded everything at the same time. Accompany is pulling this mini boss pack right before the boss here, which is like super inefficient to do, I feel like.
It seemed a bit weird because what happened is it looked like the 2 rogues actually kept running while the warrior aggroed, so I think they didn't mean to aggro that, and they kind of decided, should we kill this, should we not? Because the warrior was just fighting for a bit alone at 50%, and then the rogue said, okay, let's do it. They came back in, and it looks like they're just committing to killing this pack. Hopefully it doesn't take them over that 100% threshold, else they will actually need to deal with the 5th Reaping Wave, unless they have Shadow Meld available to them. But, speaking of 5th Reaping Wave, Zara, I mean, 99% already for Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue, and they're not even anywhere near the second boss, and they still have 2 mobs, so they're going to proc it here.
Well, it looks like they didn't mean to pull those. They were all kind of standing there, like, oh, did somebody just pull those mobs? We didn't mean to pull those mobs, because if they meant to pull these mobs, they probably would have only pulled one of them to hit the 100% trash count, not both of them.
Yeah, so, I mean, a bit of a slip-up on both sides. Fortunately, for Accompany, they had actually the kind of range to do that and not proc their 5th Reaping, but Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue, the story just keeps getting worse for them after that initial wipe on the first boss. Looks like they'll have to deal with that Reaping here in just a moment as they off that last explosive before killing those 2 sappers. Accompany, though, now on Azeroth, Zyro, so not too dangerous of a boss, but definitely very front-loaded in terms of danger. Sure,
I feel like the danger of this might be the most dangerous boss in the dungeon just because of the group comp these guys run. Having triple melee plus a warrior tank means that you kind of have to kite in a circle around. Obviously, each of these Earth Ragers will fixate one person in the group, and if they manage to melee that person, will put a stacking physical bleed debuff on them, which once it stacks to like 4 or 5, it starts doing a lot of damage to you. You can see the monk getting chunked by that debuff there.
Yeah, no, pretty dangerous as they desperately kind of kite around in circles. Now, I do like what they're doing. They're trying to be as efficient as possible. So instead of kiting the rock mobs just, a million yards away from the boss, they try to encircle around, getting as much cleave damage as you can. Accompany doing well there to dodge that tectonic smash, which is a frontal shockwave from the boss that will stun you and deal a moderate amount of physical damage, but more importantly, just lose a lot of time if you get stunned.
Right, and like you mentioned, it is almost all front-loaded damage. Once they deal with those 4 Earth Raiders, it's almost gone. And we see how important that front-loaded damage is. We see Buff War Nerf Rogue committing their Bloodlust to the beginning of this boss, which means they won't have it for the rest of the dungeon if everything goes perfectly.
If everything goes perfectly, but... yeah, no, I mean, you're right. Like, I don't think there's any way they're going to take 10 minutes to get to the last boss. They're already done. They're already done trash completely. They're just going to Shadow Meld past this point. So we'll have to see how the 4th and 3rd boss struggle for them. So Accompany, of course, not following suit, not really feeling that Azarok, the 2nd boss, is the most dangerous of the remaining 3, and opting to use their Bloodlust earlier, so they don't have it available for another 4 minutes now. But 35% on the board for Accompany. The rest of the fight is a bit of a snooze fest. Once you do kill those initial Az, it's just about making sure you move out of the way. Tank damage is quite unsubstantial, moderate at highest from Azarok.
Yeah, I mean, well, like we mentioned, once the Earth Raiders are dead, this fight is pretty much just a patchwork tank and spank. Sit there, hit the boss, make sure you don't get hit by any of the frontal abilities, and just finish it off. Now, Accompany does still have to deal with their last Reaping Wave. We saw that Buff War Nerf Rogue procced their 5th Reaping Wave off of those 2 sappers they pulled, Shadow Melded, then stealth straight up to the boss.
I'm going to be curious to see where they deal with their Reaping Wave as well, because oftentimes teams turn around and kind of deal with that mini boss pack, kill 1 or 2 of the mobs, and then just run on down the hill in the cart, and then use their Shadow Meld near the 3rd boss. So they're going to kind of reach a bit further down the hill, unless they want to deal with something towards the 3rd boss, but that trash is a mess. Nobody ever deals with that. So let's see right here. And I'm apparently eating my words as they get over to the cart, and we'll be heading down. So they still have 2% to make up, 4% to make up somewhere in this dungeon.
Right, and I mean, if we wanted to theorize what they could pull that last Peacekeeper that's right before the 4th boss. That is 4% by itself, so I mean, it's super inefficient to kill because it has so much HP, and we see them just pulling this pack of rats right here.
Okay, so the rats get killed off quickly. You want to make sure you do kill those off quickly. Maybe a bit of CC as well, as they will fixate players and grow with damage done the longer they stay alive, but no trouble for the amount of AoE damage that these 2 LL Rogues plus the Prot Warrior can output. They're dealing with the last 2 mobs right now, should proc their 100%. I doubt that they're going to sit here and kill the Reaping. I expect them to just kind of gun over to the 3rd boss and use their Shadow Meld Zyro.
Yeah, well, like we mentioned this last week, you actually have about a 1-second period where you can mount up while the Reaping is spawning. And we see them some of them doing it here, yeah. So what they're going to do is they're going to run straight to the boss. They're going to pull all the trash with it because they don't really care. Their tank will just take aggro. They'll run to the far side of the boss, and they'll be able to actually Shadow Meld all the trash they pulled, plus the 5th Reaping Wave.
This is where I'm really scared. Look at all these explosives spawning. They don't have a lot of area to line of sight, so the warrior does go down from the explosives. Fortunately, they manage to outrange the rest of the explosives, and they'll just res the poor Prot Warrior who sacrificed their life for this mighty deed. So we'll be moving over to the 3rd boss. You said the 2nd boss is the most dangerous for the comp. I think the 3rd boss is perhaps the most dangerous overall, or close to the 4th boss, but really scary in terms of tank damage output, and is very stressful for the healer with the amount of debuffs that go out. So if you start to bait some of this Azurite ground, as we can see here for Buff Warrior Nerf Wrong, in the wrong area, and don't manage to clean it properly, it could be pretty stressful.
Yeah, this is one of those. I mean, these last 2 bosses in this dungeon are definitely huge area of denial bosses. It's how you can deal with the space you have available to you and make sure that you don't accidentally run out of room. So this boss has a pretty cyclical mechanic, like you said. He'll target players and put 2 patches of goop on the ground. And then he'll also target 2 players and blow it away, as you see it doing there on the left side of Buff War Nerf Rogue. Now, this fight is all about making sure you leave room for yourself on the ground.
Yeah, so, a bit of advantage for both teams here. She will kind of do that chemical launcher debuff on 2 random players. Sorry, not 2 random, to the two closest proximity players per full cycle here. The warrior can actually spell reflect one of them quite frequently, and then they'll probably have some kind of rotation between either cloaks and anti-magic shell from the Unholy DK, because it is a lot of damage to deal with if you don't get rid of that. We can actually see just how much it chunked Kazaris there. The Unholy DK had that kind of choking icon on them. You can know that it is once again up on them them right now. So a fair bit of damage coming up on them. The healer struggling to get through that. 22% on them, so a lot of attention needed from Loda on Kazaris there. Accompany not far behind. Actually, they're both spot on with 47. Both teams have finished off their 5th Reaping Wave. The big elephant in the room, Zyro, here is really just the 8 versus 2 deaths.
Right, and the other thing to mention as well is the biggest difference here on single target damage. We have the Unholy DK versus the Windwalker Monk, who does go down for Accompany right there.
And they're just trying to even out the playfield, or can I say, as the battle res does come up for Accompany. This is actually exactly kind of what they needed to move forward with, to start kind of closing the gap for Buff Warrior, Nerf Rogue. So a bit of a lucky break there for them as they start to pull ahead by about 4 or 5% on Rixa. But advantage certainly in single target is not only the Unholy DK versus the Monk Zyro, but is also the physical debuff that the Windwalker provides on bosses for basically everybody in the group, because we have the cat form from the Resto Druid plus the Prot Warrior with 2 rogues.
And we also haven't mentioned it as well, but Buff War and Nerf Rogue already used their Bloodlust for this dungeon. The company will have that Bloodlust available for the last boss, in addition to the just better class comp they have for single target damage. So, I mean, and on top of that, we already mentioned they have 5 less deaths, so if everything goes good for them here, it should be their dungeon to take.
It should be their dungeon. You can just see how strong their single target prowess is. They fell about 4 or 5% behind when the Windwalker went down. As soon as he was brought back up, he pretty much caught up and tied the boss damage of Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue. Both bosses going down at around the same time as we see the teams take off and start to shadow meld through the rest of this trash that not a single mob will get pulled on purpose unless you're doing a death skip right at the very end. We'll have to see how cleanly they skip with the double shroud on either side as they kind of start to snake their path up.
Yeah, usually what we'll see here is teams will shroud up to about the spot where the 2 big Peacekeepers are padding back and forth, and then they'll have to just pull mobs because the last pack here does have True Sight. It will be able to see stealth. Then they'll run up into the boss room and use their Shadow Meld.
Yep, so Warrior on both sides, of course, being the one to sacrifice themselves. They have to be careful with the explosives here one more time, making sure to line of sight them or at least be healthily above 50%, but the Resto Druid does go down for Team Accompany, so a bit of an extra death there that's going to be needed. The Warrior goes down as well. Not sure how they're going to get their res here unless the Windwalker is within range of a single target res that they can cast on the Resto Druid. There are 2 deaths coming out of Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue as well, so a bit of a messy skip from them too, but finally they managed to clean it up as Loda runs over, getting ready with that mass revitalize on the group.
And just looking at these like minimal things here, Buff War will only have to use 1 mass res to everyone, whereas on the side of Accompany they'll have to use the Monk res on the Druid, and then the Druid will have to res the Warrior with the mass res because he was not in range of the Monk.
We are back to a 6 death difference between the 2 teams. 2 battle res is available just in case. Hopefully they won't need it for Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue here. No Bloodlust, available, as we can see Loda doing well to run that homing missile out of the group as to not add that damage over time to the rest of the group. Already stressful enough here, and Morito once again does not have access to that cheat death, Zyro.
Yeah, we did see him, that bite him early in the dungeon because he did get aggro after the tank died and just instantly died not having that cheat death available to him. They do have battle reses available if that does happen again, but we'll have to hope that it doesn't happen to him there.
I mean, battle res is something they don't want to be using. They're already 6 deaths behind, and they're slightly ahead on the boss, but we haven't even seen the Bloodlust come out of Team Accompany just yet. Now, on this boss specifically, you can see a nice view here from our observers on the left. You can imagine the platform as a roughly 3x3 grid. You will have one of those kind of mechs on the side for the rows and the columns going in and filling up a row and a column. You have to find the safe spots. And, of course, Zyra, at 50%, we will enter that phase transition.
Yeah, and once they enter that phase transition... Oh, we do see the Windwalker going down without a battle res on the side of Accompany. That's killer. I mean, honestly, at this point, they might have to just wipe it because 1 DPS down means you're killing the boss a third slower.
A third slower. There's no debuffs that are going to come in on the 2 transition ads from the Monk as he's dead and, well, can't do that. They haven't committed their Bloodlust yet, but at this point, it looks like they're just not going to... They're not making the call. Maybe they are making the call to die. I'm not really sure. They're kind of half staying alive, and they ran into the fire, dot on the entire group. So a bit of sloppiness coming out here from Team Accompany as Mogul Razdunk is just now reaching 50% for the side of Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue entering their transition phase. We see the two Sky Scorchers finally spawn on the platform, Zyra.
Yeah, these 2 Sky Scorchers are pretty decent. They're not too difficult to deal with. They don't do that much tank damage. Their biggest mechanic is that they'll target players in the raid with a red laser beam. You see it going on the Warrior tank there. You can split the damage with the person targeted by standing in that red beam. Typically, it doesn't do enough damage to one-shot a player, but just spreading out the damage between the group is pretty easy to do.
And the real danger, actually, to that beam is that it does decrease your incoming healing by 35%. So, you know, depending on who takes it, you don't want to have too much damage and have the healer stress out with getting you through that. But they do well bait the boss around to these different pillars here. As you can see, you have to smash all 3 in order for the boss to get rid of that 99% reduced damage taken shell here. Both teams at the same spot. We see the Bloodlust has finally come out of Team Accompany during this transition to make sure that they could get rid of those 2 Sky Scorchers. Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue now out of that transition phase, back in phase 1. Exactly the same one we saw from 100 to 50 Zyro. But I mean, this is going to be a close one between the 2 teams.
Yeah, I think it's going to be. Well, I mean, I feel like them using their Bloodlust in the transition is really, really bad. You want to use it on the single target boss encounter so you can get through the fight quicker. I feel like they would have used it at this point in the fight if they had the Monk available, but because they only had 2 DPS on the Warrior tank to DPS down the 2 intermission ad phases, they had to use it there to get through the fight.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big commitment from Team Accompany, not opting to res, not opting to wipe and then have a full team res, but they also didn't have the Shrouds available if they did that, so it could have been quite a mess. Not sure what the Shadow Melt status was for them. But the main name of the game here is that Mogul is at 18% for Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue. Finally, the last Bloodlust does go up from them, looking to get as much time as possible. Once this boss dies, Team Accompany will have 25 seconds to try and finish off their boss in order to take game 1.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually so much closer than you think it is. When this boss goes down, it's not over yet. Like you said, they have 25 seconds to finish this boss off, which they actually can do if they get good RNG on those rogues. You know those rogues are praying for 5 buffs right now.
You gotta get those good rolls, practicing at Casino every night. Mogul is about to die here. We have the Rider come out of the mech, finally goes down, so the clock is frozen here for Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue. All eyes on the remaining 20 seconds for Team Accompany. I think it's just a bit too much for them to do. They have to do over 1% per second here. That's just too much.
Yeah, I think it's just far too much for them, honestly. That little bit too little too late. They had the dungeon. We said it earlier. All they had to do was play clean, and the Monk going down just sealed it for them.
Yeah, and that was just unlucky. So the last 2 seconds here, unfortunately, just will not be enough. So Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue do end up taking this first game 1-0 in a bit of a slot fest. I can already see Sour smiling on the desk here for the analysis that's about to come, Jack.
Yeah, but after kind of a comedy of errors, you are seeing a Buff Warrior taking that game 1 there. And Sour's, you know, it really wasn't going the way that we thought it was going to be going.
I think that's a game of throws.
Yeah.
That you tend to have. That can happen in the MDI. You know, the company was looking pretty good. Like, they almost had the game handed to them, and then they got
They did. They had it completely handed to them.
They got Mogul Raz dunked at the very end there, which is really terrible when they had it in their bag. So this first wipe from Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue was so sad. And then, Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue comes again. They ended up pulling the Coin Operator Crowd Plumber a little bit faster than Accompany, but Accompany killed it first, right? And so that's the difference of having that Windwalker for that 5% single target damage buff for all of their physical, right? But it didn't matter. They just did so much faster on all the trash, and then that one critical error on the very last boss. It was like, this game was a lot closer than it needed to be.
Yeah, and we're really seeing how, you know, maybe we're seeing the disparities really kind of coming to fruition here between East and West so far here, trying to compare some of these teams up together and, you know, where those errors start happening and how they're really not able to recover out of any of these situations, Luke.
I mean, it was just, I don't know what to say on top of what Sour's already said. It was just a game of throws constantly back and forth. Just the hiccups on the Windwalker was just so costly. And the Windwalker had a spot death too on the third boss, if I'm not mistaken, as well. So, you know, a bit of sloppiness coming out of both teams. It's actually, I'm quite excited to see the rest of the series, but in the grand scheme of things, both these teams got to clean it up, especially versus the West.
Yep, big thing is we're going to be moving on to game 2 in Ataldazar here, so don't go anywhere, guys. The Mythic Dungeon International will return right after this break. Welcome back to the Mythic Dungeon International here. After a shaky first game in the Motherlode, Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue has taken game 1 versus Accompany here. Game 2 is going to be moving on to Ataldazar here, Sours, and Dungeon that we've seen some very fast performances thus far, but with a necrotic affix, there's always going to be room for more errors and those simple tank deaths.
I also don't think we gave enough credit really to teaming and what it does to a dungeon, right? Where teaming just means that, like, the pulls you would normally do to finish a dungeon aren't enough. And whenever you have to add more pulls into a dungeon, you're going to be going slower, especially if they're in awkward places.
Yeah, and we're looking at the maps right now. We have to look at Ataldazar, and we've seen those difficulties in the past with the teaming, with Fortified together. Very high trash density here, and a lot of dangerous pulls here, Sloot, especially after Volcall.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this in the first series as well, so for those tuning in just now. Necrotic, not as dangerous as last week's Waycrest Manor. You just don't have the same enclosed spaces, but there are, I would say, 3 main trash pulls that are very dangerous in this dungeon. The first one we're going to see right off the bat up to the left as the teams go up, after Vokal, as you mentioned, should be an 8-pack pull, and the final one right in front of the Priestess as well. So those are all, a lot of danger zone for the tanks especially, but even some kind of clip damage onto the melee should the tank kite too far.
I think that I would like to see, Buff War Nerf Rogue to just clean up their play. This first game jitters happens so much in the MDI where you get there, the key's about to start, your heart's going crazy, and then you just start throwing it away. So maybe they'll clean it up a little bit this one. This team was very dominant in time trials over Accompany, with the exception of one dungeon, and we see a change here.
Yeah, we are looking at the Unholy DK getting switched out here, as we're not having nearly the trash density going from Mudlow to a Taldazar here, so going to be big for them to be able to have that extra little bit of physical damage there. Moving on into game 2 here, Accompany needs this one to be able to stay alive. Moving into the Taldazar, Buff War Nerf Rogue versus Accompany.
Zyro?
Salute.
So, interesting about this dungeon, this is definitely one of the kind of mainstay or, the first dungeons that we really previewed in this expansion, akin to something like Darkheart Thicket in Legion. So players are very, very familiar with running through this place. Very aggressive pull coming out of Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue here on the left already, running right in. We do have a double Confessor in there, if I'm not mistaken. Want to make sure you pay attention to those Bonsomdi's Mantles cast, and of course the Mending Ward cast. A lot of healing and a lot of CC crowd control, reduction, and immunity should one of those bubbles go off. But Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue right in there, Zyre, with that Bloodlust.
And right away in this dungeon, you can see the difference that teaming has on this dungeon. You see that extra teaming pack that isn't normally there on the side of Accompany. You can see it in the back there. Those 2 extra Colossus makes it so they can't do their typical strategy of having the healer jump up on that staircase and bait the Juggernauts there.
Yeah, so certainly a bit of reluctance there from them. But they do pull some of the trash in the back, hiding around the left, if I'm not mistaken, 1 extra Augur and a Juggernaut. Now, the Juggernaut is the danger mob that you were talking about in terms of charging the furthest target and doing a bit of an AoE sweep. Can't do a lot of damage, especially because it does buff itself with an interruptible enrage, but interrupts are probably held up on the Augur and Confessors right now for both sides. Accompany looking to chew through the rest of them. Both Bloodlusts have been used just 2 seconds apart for the teams. Buff Warrior, Nerf Rogue just slightly ahead on trash with 13%, but I mean, they're neck and neck right now.
Yeah, and we actually saw a very cool variation in pull differences there from Team Buff War Nerf Rogue. They had their monk jump off the cliff, pull the Sky Screamer, and port back up so that it would snap to him, and they actually have a Sky Screamer in this pull with them here.
Yeah, it's really, really nice to see from them. We actually saw in the previous series as well, one of the teams jump down and grab them after they kill everything. So, and one of the teams actually went up and after Razan and grabbed them. So very popular to grab these 2 Sky Screamers as long as they're interrupted. Want to make sure to interrupt that AoE terror cast. Otherwise, it will fear the group. It's on a 15-second timer, so 1 melee can handle it. Little snapping technique coming out of Accompany here that we've seen some teams use, especially in this East Cup so far, where you jump to a position and the mobs can't get to you, so they kind of teleport on top of you, looking to get those swords in place so you can reduce their jump damage as well.
Yeah, and even though we saw them do different pull patterns here, they pretty much both do the same thing. They both jump down. Both of them pull the Reaping with their next pack, so Team Buff War Nerf Rogue pulled the Reaping into their next pull here, which was swords plus the other Sky Screamer that they left behind. And the company pulled the Reaping into the boss, so they're getting a little extra boss damage out of this.
Yeah, so that's the kind of efficiency that we want to see from teams, and we even saw it in the West Cup last week, and even so far in the East Cup, that some of the teams, especially Skyline, were a bit lacking in the department of really combining their Reaping, efficiently into other packs. Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue goes ahead and actually starts to clear more trash. This is a particularly dangerous pull here. It's 3 Sky Screechers because of the teaming affix. Usually there's only 1, but they should have substantial enough CC crowd control as we see the Ring of Peace go down here so that the Warrior can safely kite away and get rid of those necrotic stacks. But as long as they're on top of those interrupts for the Sky Screamers, it should be okay. Accompany now just doing their first kite of Razan at 51%. Or sorry, their second one, excuse me.
Yeah, it was their second kite. Not too big of a deal, honestly, because usually what they'll do is they'll shadow meld the kites anyways so that they don't happen in the first place. that was the biggest difference we saw. We saw the Unholy DK swap to the Windwalker in this Necrotic Dungeon. Having access to that Ring of Peace and that leg sweep over just the AoE damage that an Unholy DK does in this dungeon is just so much more useful in terms of utility.
A really aggressive pull here from Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue. Now, we know one of the most dangerous mobs in this pack is the one that is currently crowd controlled on your screen. Finally, the Paralysis is broken on the Honor Guard. You want to make sure... Now, the biggest thing here is we have 3 Shield Bearers, if I'm not mistaken. 2 Shield Bearers, if I'm not mistaken. These Shield Bearers have that AoE aura that reduces all damage taken by their friendlies within by 90%. So if you don't interrupt that up with your CDs up right away, you're losing a ton of damage. They do have Shockwave and Leg Sweep, which help a lot. A lot of damage coming in on Ching right now, though, with all the Necrotic stacks getting there. He tries to leap to safety right now as the rest of the pack tries to peel. But Zyra, this is one of those packs that's really dangerous. As I said, if the Warrior, the tank, is out of proximity, you're getting rending bleeds on the melee as well, including those shield slams from the Shield Bearers.
Yeah, and part of the problem there is that they'll get those shield barriers up, and they won't be able to go in to interrupt them because the other one will just shield bash them to the face. So this is just a super dangerous pull in general because the amount of CC that you have to use to deal with it is just out of this world.
They do manage to pull it off, although a bit sketchy at the end. Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue now mass stealths right into Volkal's room, which is actually going to be their first boss that they deal with. Razan finally falls here for Team Accompany, as they do well to pull the Sky Screamers, as we saw in the previous series, on top of the boss, interrupt it properly, and start to move their way up to the next boss. Volkal now aggroed here. We do know Zyra, of course, is a two-phase fight for those just tuning in now. We have 3 totems that need to die at the same time almost.
Yeah, he's pretty much just a bigger version of that Honor Guard that we saw earlier. Instead of having to deal with 1 totem, you have to deal with all 3 totems at the same time, and of course you have to kill them all equally, otherwise they will all heal to full again, and you'll have to deal with phase 1 again. Now, they did actually pull their 40% reaping into the boss room with them, which is kind of weird because you can't really cleave them on top of the totems. You need to individually DPS all the totems down.
Yeah, I mean, I'm liking to see this kind of efficiency out of them, but it is a lot of strain on Loda and on Ching, the Warrior tank, right now, as they kind of manage to move them around the room, finally entering in just a moment their second phase where they'll be able to more effectively cleave everything down, but unfortunately most of the Reaping Wave is actually already dead. Volkal finally enters phase 2 as the 3 totems fall. Teams often opt not to use their Bloodlust on this boss. It's really just a waste, as he has an aura that does damage to not only himself, but the party as well, so helps to kind of kill him down, not too efficient to use that Bloodlust here.
Yeah, and of course, similar to some of the bosses in Metalwood, this is just sort of an area of denial boss. You need to make sure you're slowly kiting the boss around the room, making sure you're leaving space to move into so that there's not too much goop on the ground.
Yeah, I believe that goop does despawn after about 60 seconds, so if you do have an appropriate kiting pattern, you will be able to kind of just infinitely kite around if you need it. One of the main things you want to watch out for, especially because the strategies these days call for obviously avoiding that double Honor Guard pack before the boss, is to make sure that the boss doesn't die right at the entrance, because as soon as that boss dies, the gates go down and somebody will proximity aggro that trash, which is quite lethal. Accompany now just doing their own mass shroud into the room, getting on Volkal as well, but they haven't dealt with their second Reaping Wave just yet. But they have killed Razan, so it's actually a bit closer than you think between these two teams right now.
Yeah, Teldazar is one of those cool dungeons where you can actually change up your strat a lot. You can kill bosses in a different order, and we're not really going to know for sure which team is ahead or how close these teams are until they kind of converge at the Priestess room later on, because we are going to see Buff or Nerf Rogue more than likely go down to Razan after this.
So this is one of those 3 pulls that we kind of warned about before the dungeon got started here. Very dangerous pull, because stealthed here are 4 stalkers, 2 that patrol up the stairs, and an extra 2 in the pile of 4 that appear because of the teaming affix. They have blinded one of the shield bearers in the back as to not deal with a lot of not only tank damage, necrotic stacks, but also to make it more controllable for the shield that goes up, because they can lose a ton of damage needing to deal with that. Done well here once again with the Ring of Peace to make sure that the tank can peel properly, get away, and get rid of those necrotic stacks.
And actually, just to make sure that this pull went off without a hit, you can see that they actually used blind on one of the mobs here just to remove one extra one extra variable from the equation, make sure that they could pull it off, make sure they didn't have to commit all their interrupts and their stuns to one mob. So as they start dying, they pull that last mob in. Yeah,
nice clean play here from them. They're grabbing the last shield bearer right now. We see that Paralysis come up to interrupt that kind of AoE damage reduction aura that they cast. They've opened the door up now and are ready to move on to some of the Sword and Sky Screamer packs which kind of plague the bridge leading up to the third boss. Volcall here, not to be forgotten, of course, for Team Accompany on the right, down to the last fifth of health as they go past 20%, dying rapidly, and I will expect them once again to do the same pull. Now, let's see if they're going to be a bit more aggressive here and actually deal with both shield bearers at the same time. It's dangerous, but it can pay off.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, that's going to be the difference here, right? Because they're about to proc their third Reaping Wave on the side of Buff or Nerf Rogue, whereas Accompany still hasn't procced their second yet. So they kind of need to catch up a little bit on trash while Buff or Nerf Rogue is dealing with Razan.
Yeah, exactly. Let's not forget about Razan here, the often first boss that most teams do, especially on live servers. But it is really open dungeon, as you mentioned. Very cool to see Razan finally pulled here. We're going to see it once again, a combination of Shadow Melts coming out for the fixates, making sure that the boss is stationary for maximum damage, and of course dragging it near a wall so that players can easily line of sight the AoE fear. Warrior doesn't have to worry about that for every other fear. They can use their berserking to make sure they immune that. Accompany now dealing with the entirety of the pull. As we can see, both shield bearers have been pulled, making sure that they save the leg sweep and the shockwave for the last seconds as the Warrior backpedals up the stairs with a lot of necrotic stacks. The Ring of Peace does come down, but once again, we do see some of those shield slams spilling onto the party.
And that just shows you the utility of the Windwalker Monk there. They have the leg sweep for the stuns, but in addition to that, they also Ring of Peace to allow their warrior to kite, to not deal with necrotic there. It's just a very good class in general, and not to mention the physical damage debuff, making everyone else in the group do more damage. It's just such a good pick for the meta right now. It deals with so much stuff that no other class can deal with by itself.
That Windwalker making the group 5% happier as the second Reaping Wave comes in for Accompany here. Now, I would assume and hope that once they kind of finish that pack off, they will open up this gate and take this Reaping onto the next trash pack, which it looks like is what they're doing. No, they're actually opting to play it safe, finish off the Reaping before they go to the swords. 40% here on Razan, though, Zyro, for Buff Warrior, Nerf Rogue, as they do a bit of kiting. The Warrior, unfortunately, does get scooped up with a fair bit of damage, but managed to get out right away before any of that damage kind of pounds too hard.
Yeah, we do see them also spawning a Raptor there. A little bit unfortunate. It's just a little bit of extra tank damage to deal with, as well as, I believe, a bleed debuff, if I'm not mistaken. So it's not too big of a deal to spawn too many of these Raptors. Now, if you do spawn a lot of them at the same time, it can spell disaster for your tank, but they're only spawning one or two at a time, probably for rogue single target damage, so it's not too big of a deal for them. Now, we're going to see where these teams kind of converge here. 10% on Razan versus a little bit about 9% trash difference. They're pretty close together.
Yeah, no, that's really nice to see. If we're going to talk tank on Razan, the real danger comes once per cycle. He does a bleed and physical damage taken debuff on the tank, so with the Raptors, as you're saying, on top of it is a fair bit of damage. Razan does go down and the team heads up, desperately trying to catch up to the middle area of the room where Accompany is just about to pass, so team's actually quite neck and neck at this point. 6% trash left for Accompany as they're downloading as they're downing that last Sky Screamer. Both teams in the middle area, but one extra death on the board for both Warrior and Earth and Rogue.
Yeah, and we can see how close these teams are together now. 2 boss kills. Buff or Nerf Rogue is just 6% trash percentage ahead, and the tank is incredibly low on the side of Accompany here, actually pulling this huge pack with them. Looks like they're going to be fine, but that was actually really scary for them here.
Yeah, it's that triple Sky Screamer pack that Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue handled at the beginning of the dungeon. Do manage to kind of clean up the rest of the trash as they cross along the middle, wanting to make sure not to pull that middle pack or jump too high, accidentally aggroing any of those Sky Screamers via proximity. Accompany just dealing with the rest of the triple pull there of the Sky Screamers. They head off to the exact same bridge too. They actually end up pulling both Sky Screamers down along with the extra swords and triple Sky Screamer pack. This is actually a really big, dangerous pull here.
Yeah, this is a lot of necrotic stacks on the tick. We can already see him up to 25 necrotic stacks. Once he gets to 40, he's not taking any healing. So, I mean, you have to imagine that they have to deal with all those swords instantly, which they, of course, do. The interrupts in the Sky Screamers is not that big of a deal since they're running a full melee group. The Sky Screamers at AoE Fear has a 15-second cooldown, which just so happens to be the same cooldown as your typical melee interrupt. So the real big thing to deal with there was a necrotic, which they dealt with perfectly.
That pull actually jumped them well ahead of Accompany right now. We did have a death on the side of Accompany go down as well, as the Windwalker actually goes down as well right now for their second death. They do have the battle reses available. Probably don't want to use it though, as we see the Windwalker release and start to run down. The run from the beginning of the dungeon to anywhere in this dungeon is not too long, but once again, losing a lot of damage here. The Windwalker's running back. There's no 5% physical debuff on these swords along with the Sky Screamer, so a bit of a time tank here for Accompany, unfortunately, as Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue cleans up the 4-pack right before the fire stairs.
Yeah, I mean, this is just kind of a little bit too slow from Accompany. If I wanted to see them go fast, I would like to see them pull these Sky Screamers into the 4-pack, because there's not really any extra threat from pulling the Sky Screamer there. You're not proccing any extra reaping. You're not really giving yourself too much danger. Your tank's not going to overload on necrotic. they're just going a little bit too slow. They're being too safe.
Yeah, interesting to note as well that we actually have a dwarf warrior on the side of Accompany, so they can kind of use their stone skin to often get out of a necrotic free stack once every 2 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. So nice racial advantage there as Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue starts to deal with a pretty hefty pull upstairs, looking to proc their 4th Reaping, which they do right now. It starts to collide on top of the group. Now, I don't think they actually pulled the mass pack in front of the 3rd boss just yet, Zyro.
No, they didn't yet, and it looks like they're actually going to they're probably planning on using their Bloodlust for that big pack here. Now, we have seen some groups pull that 4th Reaping Wave into the big pack here, but the thing about this team is they probably know they're slightly ahead. They can probably play it safe and just pull the pack by itself without all the reaping, which is definitely what they're planning on doing.
Yeah, I mean, most people do have access to a second monitor these days, so they're keeping a close eye on what's going on there. Team Accompany now just going up the stairs past those fire mask totems on the sides of the wall. Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue menacingly looking at the final pack before the 3rd boss as they kite away, waiting for those necrotic stacks to drop. Here comes the Priestess on the side and the big pull coming in from Ching as he groups everything up together. Bloodlust does go off and just huge amounts of AoE damage going off. The Prot Warrior just rocketing up with that T-Clap, X-T-Clap spam that we all know and love so much in this current meta. 15 seconds into their Bloodlust. He will need to start kiting soon, though, because those necrotic stacks are not going anywhere.
Yeah, and we'll probably see the Ring of Peace plus Lex Wave come out from the Monk there. That Monk utility going crazy. We see the Warrior starting to drop pretty low, and he'll probably jump out here very soon. Now, the Prot Warrior is doing a lot more than 40k, which is really impressive. The Windwalker's kind of lagging behind. I mean, we see the Windwalker doing a lot more on the side of Accompany for that big pull here. I don't know if he might have focused his clones or something. Sometimes you can do that as a Windwalker, but nonetheless, they deal with the pack perfectly. Warrior doesn't even have to kite. Moving right on to Priestess Alunza.
No problem for them as they get their 5th Reaping Wave in on top of Priestess Alunza. Interesting to see a lot of groups kind of try to skip this 5th Reaping Wave in this dungeon, but nonetheless, they're confident they just want to cleave it down. They have more than enough crowd control to get ready for the masks on this fight. They have Double Blind, they have a Paralyze, they have a Root, so, I mean, they're probably not going to deal with more than 2 masks anyway, so not a big deal for them. Accompany still dealing with their own big pull on the side. They will likely, looks like they have 4 mobs left, so they're actually going to be just shy of their 5th Reaping Wave, if I'm not mistaken, and they will probably opt to save it for the end. We'll see the exact percentage here in a second as Aches actually goes quite low here, getting chunked right before that Fiery Enchant goes off 20%. Do manage to heal him up with the Fireball dots as well.
And he's actually a lot safer than we mentioned. He didn't even proc his Cheat Death there, so while it did seem like he was very low and very in danger there, he didn't even proc his Cheat Death, which I believe is a 90% damage reduction once you go below 10% health. So still having that available to him, he's still perfectly safe.
Perfectly safe indeed. Accompany now just looking to clean up the rest of the trash as they head off for Priestess Alunza, who's already at 20% and falling quickly, of course, because of the AoE damage done from the group absorbing those blood pools. 3% left on her. Want to make sure to CC any of the remaining masks, although they're not going to have another round of transfusion anyway, Zyro.
Yep, just very, very easily, very quickly getting through Priestess Alunza. Obviously, like you said, the transfusion is the main mechanic to the boss here. You see these little blood pools spawning around the room. Each player will have to pick one of them up when the boss gets to 100 energy. The boss will cast transfusion on the group. And if done properly, if all 5 players have the debuff, the boss will take about 25% of her health and damage.
About indeed. Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue already done with the 5th Reaping Wave as they hurry along to the last boss. In just a moment, they'll be reaching this kind of wall that has turned into stairs. Somebody ran ahead, one of the rogues, if I'm not mistaken, Tomboy has done that to get that RP or role-playing ready so that the players can just easily glide up the stairs. Dodging these spiders, nice view here from the observers, making sure that none of them collide with them. I mean, 2 of those spiders will spell death for you. We are in a fortified dungeon, Zyra, but the spiders here on Yasma actually still deal a substantial amount of damage as they crowd the room.
Yeah, that's one of the major things to look out for in this fight. So, as you move on in this fight, there are basically 3 major mechanics to look for. The first one, you can see the arrows going out onto each of the players right now, which will spawn a clone of themselves. Those clones will slowly walk towards the boss, and if they reach the boss, they'll put a large shadow debuff on the entire group. The other major mechanic to speak of are these spiders that slowly move around the room.
Yeah, these spiders do a fair bit of damage, as we mentioned a few times, and should you collide with them, they explode and leave a kind of shadow pool, void zone, if you will, on the ground for the remainder of the fight. So definitely a lot of area denial should the fight go on too long. In this fortified setting, nothing to worry about too much, though. Yasma now at 60%, likely to reach her next round of 100 energy shortly here. The team's doing really nicely, though, to not move too far from the boss when spawning their images, so they can still kind of get a bit of splash damage. So we'll see how they handle it here, but that does become more difficult to do as the fight goes on longer because of the spiders that are actually just fixated coming in right now.
Of course, if they do spawn them a little bit too close, or if they start to get too close to the boss, they do have the leg sweep as well as the Ring of Peace. And if they really, really need it, they also have the Druid knockback, just in case. So while it does look like they're just wanting them kind of too close, they're always perfectly safe.
Now, one of the nice things about the full melee comp along with the rest of Druid here is that they can actually pinpoint kind of bait all of the spiders that go along with the group, so they're not running all over the place. So they're just easily doing a corner-to-corner strat in a rectangle around the room, making sure that they only move when the spiders fixate, grouping them all nicely behind the boss, and spawning the images in the front of the boss. Now, we have a small spider spawn right in front of them, so they're going to have to be careful of where they drop that, as it does come in and split the group just a bit. The tank does well to move around. Shield wall immediately getting popped there. A bit of mess coming up as he had to run through one of the spiders right now. We have a cheat death proc over for Tomboy. They do manage to recover from it. Yasma now down to 5%, and looks like we're going to have a clean 2-0, cleanish 2-0 sweep coming out of Buff Warrior Nerf Rogue here in just a moment.
Yasma going down here, and Buff War seals that 2-0 victory over Accompany here on Ataldazar. And like you said, it was a clean-ish run, about 18-minute run that we've seen previously, so wasn't going to be as fast as that battle for champion here, Sours.
Yeah, it was, it was better than the last one. They didn't choke nearly as hard as the first time. They cleaned up a lot of their play. They have significantly less deaths than the last time. And the speed at which Buff War Nerf Rogue handles trash packs especially is so much faster than Accompany, right? The Accompany kills his first boss significantly before Buff War Nerf Rogue does, but by around the time that the second boss dies, Buff War Nerf Rogue has got a huge trash lead, where even though Accompany had sort of like a boss lead at this point, there was like 2 bosses to 1 boss, but it was like 60% trash count versus like 37% trash count, right? And that difference there on those 2 bosses, just kind of like, that gap is like 2.5, 3 minutes. So then when they finally kill the third boss, they've got kill count. They're so far ahead, really, because of all that. How well they just killed the trash compared to the other team.
Yeah, it seemed like they were kind of thrown off a little bit at the start when they had to watch for those golems that were going into that very first pulls around. I know you mentioned that previously. And because the Druid was kind of baiting out any of the wild charges so quickly and so closely to the rest of the group, it did cause that early death that we saw. Just a little bit sloppier early on.